Other things, obviously, you can have a look at our events page, but we've got a new course, actually, planting design course coming up at Surge Hill, and that's going to be done over 3 days, sort of, one in May, one in July, one in September. And that's really interesting. We're getting a lot of interest in that. So have a look on the events page because there's quite a lot to it. It is a course rather than just to show up and kind of attend a workshop. So it has a sort of a link to it, has a string of stuff that you have to do, which is great. We're also going to be at NEP in June again with James Hitchmo and Charlie, which we did last year, which was fantastic. One more I'll mention, which is an event at Wakehurst Place with Eric Anderson and Henrik Schoeman, and that's in June. Obviously, we have lots of courses in July and then September and October, but I just want to mention a few, all on our events page. Have a look and see. So that's kind of what's coming up. So that brings us to this evening, and my guest tonight is Harry Hoblyn. Hello, Harry.
Good evening.
Hello, hello. Harry is the head gardener at Charleston you're in East Sussex, actually. I was about to
East
say West
Sussex. Yeah,
Sussex, but you're over the border. You're in
yeah,
West,
we
you're in
are
East
the
Sussex. Yeah.
borderlands.
Yeah, that's right. And so it's lovely to have Harry here, and we've got lots to talk about. Once we start chatting, I'm going to put on a rolling slideshow with images of the garden, and so we will go into that. But let's just have a little chat to start with, Harry. So it's lovely to have you here. Thank you so much for giving up your time to do this, which is
Thank
really
you very
nice.
much for inviting me.
Thank you. For those people who don't know where Charleston is, can you just give us a sort of geographical, people might have heard of it, but not know exactly where it is.
Sure. So Charleston is about 5 miles from Lewes, which is about 5 miles from Brighton in Sussex, East Sussex, as you say.
Hmm.
And it's basically just north of the South Downs. So you look
Hmm.
onto the South Downs from Charleston. It's effectively on farmland. So there's the village of Firle nearby
Hmm.
um, is we're surrounded by farmland, which is owned by the estate of Firle Estate, basically, which is owned by the
Hmm.
Gage family, coincidentally, where the green gage comes from.
Oh.
So the historical background is that when they moved here in 1916 to Charleston, they were initially tenants, and actually they never actually owned the property. This is the Bloomsbury set I'm talking about. And it was only in the 80s when the garden was restored that the Bloomsbury set, basically, the people restoring it, acquired the property.
Oh.
So from 1916 onwards, when they moved to Charleston, yeah, they were renting off the Firle estate.
Oh.
And you're sort of surrounded by farmland. So it's still very much surrounded by farmland, quite literally.
Mm.
We have
Mm.
tractors. There's a milking barn attached to a recently renovated hay barn, so you can, until recently, you'd sit in at certain events and you'd hear the whirring of the milk machine, quite literally.
And the
Um,
cows, yeah,
so
yeah,
yeah, it's a beautiful place to be, and I once upon a time, I suppose, would have been quite a remote place.
yeah.
Um, Unfortunately, we have a road quite nearby now, which is the A27, but it's, and also quite close to London. So from, Lewes, you can get to London within an hour, basically, by
Yeah,
train.
yeah, yeah. No, it is in the most beautiful location, and Harry and I were just talking about it because around that part of East Sussex, it's the landscape is so gorgeous because there's a sort of lack of trees in the immediate vicinity, but what you see is this beautifully sculpted South Downs. It's very dramatic.
Yeah, exactly. It's
Uh,
it's Eric Ravilius country. If you know
oh
the
yeah,
artist Eric Ravilius, these rolling hills, basically, and not much arboreal cover, basically.
yeah,
You've got lots of
yeah, yeah,
and grazing land, really, and obviously
exactly.
increasingly sort of regeneration in terms of the wildflower population, which is nice. And those
Yeah.
meadows, which I suppose over time have been damaged, but you can walk on the downs and start to feel that they're coming back to life in places, which is nice.
Yeah, yeah. And just before I start rolling the slides, so how long have you been there, Harry? How long have you been working there?
So I have been at Charleston 6 years now, just over 6 years. I think it was in
Wow.
March 2019 that I started at Charleston.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and I actually started as a trainee, actually. Uh,
Right.
it was a 1 year traineeship working under Fiona Dennis, who was the head
Hmm.
gardener at the time.
Hmm.
And through various sort of coincidental happenings, and the pandemic being one of those things, I ended
Hmm.
up staying on in the garden. Fiona had left actually just before the pandemic, and I was kind of in this sort of temporary role looking after the garden with a opportunity lined up elsewhere. I was actually due to go and work at Sissinghurst, which in some regards is a sister
Oh,
garden to Charleston
right.
because
Yeah.
of that Bloomsbury connection.
Yeah.
Um, but I sort of opportunistically, but also thinking perhaps my job offer at Sissinghurst might fall through because of the pandemic. Sent an email out and said, "Would you like me to look after the garden? You know, longer term. Perhaps we don't know how long this is going to, last, this pandemic." And sort of the day that they said yes, we'd love you to stay and look after the garden, and they gave me a sort of 1 year contract, was the same day that Sissinghurst said, "I'm sorry, we can't offer you your role.
Oh,
We're going to
right.
have to
So,
withdraw that job offer, understandably, given what was going on." So yeah, felt very grateful to kind of have that opportunity to stay embedded in this small, because it's a relatively small garden. It's a walled
yeah.
garden that we look after.
Yeah.
Um, not more than about a quarter of an acre, really.
Yeah.
And then there's a pond, some woodland, small area of woodland, what was traditionally known as the paddock, and a very small orchard, as well as the
Mm,
kind of hay barns and the areas sort of surrounding the hay barn,
mm.
which are kind of these sort of farmyard aesthetic kind of
Yeah.
areas. So it's quite rustic. So yeah, I felt quite blessed in some regards. Also, I would probably be in a very different place if I'd ended up at Sissinghurst or another
Yeah.
garden. But also, I've had the opportunity to really sort of carve out my own journey in horticulture, which I'm really grateful for,
Hmm.
and sort of have, this idea of like the garden as a playground, I suppose, which has been
Yeah.
what it has been for me
Yeah.
since that point, really. I'm one of those people that had a was very fortunate during that pandemic to be able to work quite close to Charleston, and I actually carried on working throughout the duration of that period. And
Yeah.
yeah, it was quite a very special, formative time for me. So yeah, I'm very grateful for it.
Fantastic. And what were you doing before Charleston? So were you in horticulture, or was this a change of career?
So my journey into horticulture is I did a history degree. I'd kind of always had an interest in connection to nature, kind of grew up in the countryside. And my dad bought a very derelict farm in France when I was about 15. So I spent a lot of time walking around the woods there, going down to the river. He
Wow.
had a couple of
Yeah.
meadows. So I kind of spent a lot of time outdoors. Did a history degree, like I say, didn't really know what I wanted to do.
Hmm.
And then I took myself off to Columbia and taught English in Columbia for about a year, during which point I also traveled around a lot,
Hmm.
volunteered on a coffee farm, and kind of found this deeper connection with nature, I suppose, and this interest unfurling itself in not just plants, but rivers and mountains and food as well. Food became an important thing for me as well. So I kind of came back to the UK, still not really knowing what I wanted to do, and my mum was quite a keen food grower. She has an allotment, so I kind of got
Yeah.
involved with that, and then found myself in Brighton, not really knowing what I was doing in a city. It's not really me, and found this opportunity to work on a farm, actually, small scale farm just outside Lewes, so not far from where I still am. And I sort of lived on this farm, literally in a tent for about 8 months, kind
Right.
of almost through the winter as well. It was really sort of immersive, waking up at 3, 4, 5 a.m. picking. It's actually a Japanese vegetable farm, owned by a lovely couple called Robin and Akuko. Um, and again, just sort of immersed myself in nature and got really passionate, I suppose, about food growing, some all
Hmm.
organic, sort of natural agriculture
Hmm.
principle growing. And then this kind of transitioned into, okay, maybe I'm more interested in plants. I then sort of worked for a landscape gardener for a bit, somebody who designed and did the sort of implementation of the gardens themselves. In Sussex, a guy called Peter Baldock, and his um, brother-in-law Tom. Um, and I kind of just thought, okay, now I'll start my RHS courses. I'll do the RHS courses. So I went to
Oh, right.
Plumpton, which is a college not far from
Yes, not
here,
far away. Yeah.
do the practical courses, and sat really and decided, okay, actually, I don't want to go to college for the theory stuff. I'll do that myself, kind of teach myself
Hmm.
syllabus, print it all off and whatnot, and sat the exams for that at Wisley. And that was kind of completed, I think, during that year of traineeship.
Hmm.
So that kind of put me in good stead at that point to then go off and look for jobs at places
Yeah.
like us, for example. So I kind of, yeah, when I found myself being the sole kind of person looking after the garden, the custodian of the garden, I'd kind of really just finished in some
Yeah.
regards that training. So yeah, like I say, to have the opportunity to then really play around with looking after a
Fantastic.
kind of highly aesthetic ornamental space was
Yeah.
really blessed and lucky
Well,
place to
and
be.
also with you having the history background, doing a history degree as well. I mean, that's the two strands coming together beautifully.
I think that's one of
Fantastic.
the things that really sparked my interest about being there. Actually, for me,
Yeah.
is I'm interested in art, literature, history, of course. So
Yeah.
to be somewhere where that's so much a part of what goes on,
Yeah.
and the history of the place was important to me. I was trying to explain to somebody, perhaps in a different life, I might have ended up going to Wisley or Kew,
Yeah.
for example, but I'm not sure that that's me. So
Yeah. Yeah.
that's the great thing about horticulture is you chat to people from all different spheres who have come into the world of horticulture at so many different angles, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm just going to now go into screen share so that we can look at some images of the
Sure.
garden. So, Harry, do you want to just start talking a little bit about the history for people
Yeah.
who don't really know much about the Bloomsbury set? And I will get this screen share going and hope that it all works smoothly.
Yeah. Of course.
Hopefully it
Great.
should. Yeah.
So we're talking about the Bloomsbury Group, which was Virginia Woolf's sister, Vanessa Bell, and her friend and lover for a time, Duncan Grant, who were both painters. And they were part of the Bloomsbury set, which also had members, people such as E.M. Forster, T.S. Eliot, Lytton Strachey, Virginia, of course, Virginia's husband, Leonard Woolf. And they, during this sort of First World War period, were for the most part principally conscientious objectors, which means they didn't want to fight effectively, these men. And they basically had this opportunity to move to Charleston. It was actually Virginia Woolf that found Charleston for them. She was living nearby. And she wrote to her sister Vanessa and said, I found this lovely property. It's got a lake. I don't know if we've got any photographs. Well, we've just seen the
Yeah, there are some coming up. Yeah.
Of this lake, which is really more of a pond, actually, I suppose. So they moved there. This was Vanessa, Duncan, and Duncan's lover at the time. He was a queer man, so his lover was David, or he was nicknamed Bunny Garnett. They moved to Charleston in 1916. Vanessa had two young sons at the time, Julian and Quinton, with her husband, Clive Bell. And they moved to Charleston, and it's quite a bleak place in winter. You're looking at quite nice summery photographs, right? But actually, it's quite an austere place to be in winter. It's an old farmhouse. It's damp. It's actually quite dark, and you've obviously got the lashing of wind and rain which comes off the downs. So I think in 1916, no electricity, no running water. It wasn't necessarily an easy place to be. And I think quite often people say, oh, they were very lucky, privileged people, because they were from a certain class. But at the same time, Duncan and David were working on the farm. I think they were working for the further state, and they were, growing turnips, picking turnips and that kind of thing. And Vanessa was trying to keep, two young boys warm. And fed and watered, I suppose, having to go and fetch water locally, and they would have had this farm, active working farm around them, and that also, somebody's calling my phone, which is over there. I'm going to try and shall I quickly just switch it off? Can you hear it?
We can hear it, but don't worry. Yeah, that's fine.
I'll quickly turn it off because otherwise it'll.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Okay, no worries.
So they moved in 1916, and obviously what they wanted to be doing, and I think they were doing, was painting, of course. So lots of their particularly early paintings is them painting the landscape around them, the buildings, the farmyard, the hayricks. In fact, there's an exhibition on at the moment of Vanessa Bell's work, and it's really brilliant to see some of her works based at Charleston, which I hadn't seen before in the flesh. And there's one I was particularly drawn to, is this sort of hayrick on a wagon, and just really sort of evocative images. But from 1918 onwards, once the war was over, they sort of started to design the garden with more aesthetic principles in mind, I suppose. Maybe there's a quote I could draw out now. So Angelica Garnett, who was actually Duncan and Vanessa's daughter, who was born on Christmas Day 1918. But later, when the garden was restored, she wrote that it was never supposed to be a gentleman's garden, nor a gardener's garden, but it was always supposed to be an artist's garden. So I guess what this means is that they were thinking about the aesthetics, and they were trying to create a garden from which they could paint from, effectively. It is a walled garden, this walled garden that you're looking at now in the pictures, which has got these wonderful fruit trees in. It would have been originally a kitchen garden, but they kind of started to redesign it. As you can see, it's got kind of these geometrically shaped beds. There's a lovely box hedge running through the south of the garden there. And you've got it's quite a rigid structure, but it's the cloud box hedge and the fruit trees, which actually are in blossom now this week, and it's kind of that peak spring Blossom Week at Charleston, they really sort of add this looser feel to the garden, and they also had these kind of Mediterranean influences. So they were growing things like cotton lavender, which edges the lawn, which is quite an unusual thing. I've never seen it anywhere else. Actually, it's kind of an edging plant for the lawn. Things like cardoons, actually, which just popped up on the screen there, and with that really sort of abundant silvery grey foliage. Dusty Miller as well, which is something you might see locally in the as part of the landscape. And then obviously hard landscaping features like this bottom here, this bottom half of a torso, which they were sort of collecting and creating. So the house itself is a really bohemian place to visit, I suppose. It's got their paintings, but it's also got it's got textiles that they created, and then the walls are painted and decorated in a very bohemian sense, and they are very much, that's probably the fundamental reason people visit Charleston, is because they've heard about the house and they want to go around the house. But then I think often they're struck then by the garden, and often that's the thing that draws them back to Charleston, perhaps for repeat visits. So I might just read another quote actually at that point.
Yeah, I just stopped sharing, but I'm gonna run through it again. So because the images are so useful for people to see. So you carry on. Yeah.
So Quentin, who was Vanessa's son, like I mentioned, when the house was restored and the garden in the 80s, he wrote that the walled garden in high summer is a dense mass of flowers, overwhelming in their variety of colour. This is a painter's garden, and like the house, was not intended to be tasteful or restrained. It is as though the exuberant decoration of the interior has spilled through the doors. So you get this idea, the house itself is very exuberant and playful and irreverent. And this is also this feeling that they were trying to recreate in the garden as well. And they were doing that with the idea that they wanted to paint the garden. So something like the cardoon leaves that we saw in one of the previous slides, these big silvery serrated leaves, they would often just pick those out and put them in a vase next to a red hot poker or a hollyhock and paint them as part of their kind of, their artistic practice of cut flower painting. So from 1918, they sort of developed this aesthetic interest in the garden. So it goes through, obviously it's different seasons. We're in that spring blossom season, like I mentioned now, and we've got the apples in flower, we've got lots of tulips in flower, we've got a carpet of forget-me-nots, but they would have been growing these things as well as perhaps wallflowers as well, which sometimes we grow at Charleston. I didn't actually bed in any wallflowers this year, but we've got some sort of perennial varieties, and then that kind of underplanting of other bulbs. So it's kind of just developed its own palette over the years, I suppose.
And your role. So how would you define your role? Because looking after a garden that is a historic garden that people have strong images of, that's been painted so much, so that So how is your role running such a garden in terms of the historic context and the artistic context?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So I always say that I use the letters that they wrote, particularly Vanessa, the paintings, the photographs, and also the sort of surviving memories of people. So, like I said, the garden was restored in the 1980s, and at that time, a plan was drawn up by the landscape architect, Sir Peter Shepherd. And I've still got a copy of it. I should have maybe, perhaps would have been interesting to show you that as well. But it's great. It sort of has the planting plan for these beds, but it's quite anachronistic, you might argue. It's kind of the time. Sir Peter Shepherd was a great landscape architect, but perhaps not a great plantsman. I don't. That's not my place to say that. But when I arrived, so the idea is that I suppose that planting plan was drawn up, looking at the paintings, looking at the photographs, looking at the letters, and the surviving accounts of friends and family, like I mentioned. But when I started in 2019, I kind of took on this legacy, working with Fiona, and she was very much interested in some of the really sort of like significant heritage elements of looking at, say, for example, there's a great painting, it's called The Garden Path in Spring, which I suppose would have been about this time of year, where you've got the apple blossom in flower and you've got this avenue of pinks running down the avenue, and that was 1940, I think that was painted, and it is a really beautiful painting. And Fiona did this wonderful research to recreate this avenue of pinks, and it was charming, very quaint, beautiful. They're a really nice variety of pinks called Dianthus or Woody Eye Alice. Actually, Allwoods was a local pinks carnations nursery not
Oh,
too far from Charleston. So it's kind of
oh,
nice that
yeah,
there was
local.
a
Yeah.
link. Fiona did that work. Like I say, we've got things like the cotton lavender edging the lawn,
Mm,
which is a very unique feature and something that I
mm,
always try to keep. With the pinks, though, however, I liked them, and I think it's a really important reference point. But it was only one point that they
mm.
were there,
Yeah.
historically speaking. And some people say, great, love the pinks. Other people will come and say to me, we quite like the pinks, but perhaps it's a bit staid. It's a bit, too smart. They want to see more chaos. And they were there. There's a quote. John Maynard Keynes was also a member of the Bloomsbury set,
Mhm.
the economist, and he talked about reading the paths with a penknife. Um, However, at other points, Vanessa writes about, plants spilling out onto the paths from the borders. So you've kind of got this idea that actually they were there from 1960 through to Duncan's death in the 1970s, where the garden was kind of in a state of disarray. So there
Right.
is this gardens, from my point of view, I think gardens are always in flux and shouldn't be static. So the pinks for
Mm,
me were a difficult one because they were actually in the shade of the house
mm.
underneath these fruit trees. They looked great for 2 or 3 years, but then what starts happening if you have a wet winter, they start to rot off. Or also that there was a particular, I think it's disease that they were getting. And I kind of personally felt, and also I think this was also in conversation with other people who are, part of the organization, but also visitors, that, perhaps it's time for a change. We don't need to be quite so rigid as to always having these pinks edging the lawn. Sorry, pinks, this pink
Yeah.
border.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, However, having said that, there are really key principles that I like to, adhere to, I suppose, and always think about when I'm planting the garden. So one of those would be this notion that the garden always wants to have fruit trees in it, for example. Um, it always wants to have roses. So Vanessa also talks about, in one of her letters, she talks about finally getting this rose garden that she wanted. I guess sort of, perhaps influenced by Vita Sackville West at Sissinghurst. So I suppose each year I'll try to think about, okay, well, are there spaces where I can, maybe plant uh, a pine, not a pioneer, but a fruit tree that's going to
Mm.
make its way through, and create that next generation of fruit within the walled garden, I suppose, and
Yeah.
likewise for the roses. So it's kind of those structural things that feel most important in terms of the planting. Um,
Yeah.
Obviously, we've got the hard landscaping that needs protecting as well. We've got this lovely piazza, which has got this kind of almost higgledy-piggledy mosaic
Mm,
creation that they sort of did together. So
mm.
they were doing what they were doing in the house, which was being very creative and playful. They were also sort of bringing out into the garden. So I suppose it's really important that we're looking after those things, and we have a curatorial and collections team, and I kind of work with them to make sure that these things are maintained and looked after. Um, but year to year, the planting, the box hedge, actually, I must say, is something else that's really important to me to try and
Yeah.
keep. So far, I've been very lucky. We have had box moth. We haven't really had blight, but I managed to keep the
Right.
box moth kind of at bay. We had, I think, 2 years ago, I kind of felt a bit worried. I remember having a bad dream about it one night.
Oh
Um,
God, you
but
poor
last
thing.
year, yeah, but I don't. Last year, I think maybe because a slightly wetter spring, I seem to remember.
Mhm.
They just didn't seem to like the conditions as much, and this year so far, I've not spotted any. Touch wood. Um,
Yeah. Good. Good.
but it's about these key principles, I suppose. So, like I say,
Yeah.
this fruit trees, this idea of Vanessa talks about this idea of sweet disorder in the garden.
Hmm.
Um, she talks about a medley of planting as well. Might be nice actually. You've got a couple of quotes here that Vanessa from extracts from Vanessa's letters. If I were to read
Mm.
some of those out actually, because then
Yeah, I do. No, that would be great.
that kind of gives you an idea of how I interpret things and what's important to me, but also obviously these are her words. Um, so she wrote in 1921. I must mention Roger Fry as well, who was sort of her co-creator and sort of planning the garden, who was an
Mhm.
artist and art critic and also her lover for a time. So he wrote, and she wrote to him in 1921. Uh, we have lots of apples, pears, and even peaches. The best I've ever eaten from our own tree, planted ourselves 3 years ago. Doesn't that make your mouth water? Um, so really quite evocative.
Mhm.
So I
Mhm.
think Fiona and I've since planted one as well. I've planted peaches and nectarines along the sort of south-facing wall of the garden to try and sort of recreate this. Yeah, just recreate
Yes.
that she did. I know she talks about one of her letters about harvesting 52 peaches.
Wow.
Not got that far yet. It seems been
Yeah.
been
No
a bit of a
pressure.
bumper year.
Yeah.
But yeah, another letter she again wrote to Roger Fry in 1926. It's so divine now, one can't bear leaving. The garden is full of dahlias and red admirals, and one can sit out all day if one likes. Um, and then I'm just going to read a couple more because they are interesting, or even just extracts from them. So again to Vanessa in 1913. The garden is incredibly beautiful. It's full of reds of all kinds, scabies and hollyhocks and mallows, and every kind of red, from red lead to black. Pokers are coming out. That's red hot pokers. It's all in very good order, and we have masses of plums and apples. I have, of course, begun by painting some flowers. It seems the inevitable way to begin here. And then in another letter, she talks about this idea of this medley of apples, hollyhocks, plums, zinnias, dahlias, all mixed up together. So that's kind of, I suppose, what I'm trying to recreate for anyone who's been to Hollyhock Charleston. You've just seen a couple in the
Yeah.
photograph. The hollyhocks, they really like this part of Sussex. We've got quite
Yeah.
nice free draining soil. You go to local villages like Alfriston Firle, you'll see there's hollyhocks growing in the cracks.
In the
Locally at
paving.
Berwick
Yeah.
Church as well, and in the paving.
Yeah.
So hollyhocks, it kind of becomes hollyhock season in August, and they kind of take over, and that's really important. People think,
Yeah. Yeah. No, last year it seemed they were extraordinary. They were so tall, weren't they? They were
yeah,
incredible.
exactly, yeah. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
quite tall myself. I'm about 6'8", so often most
Wow.
they
Yeah. Even
tend to
taller than you.
trumping me for height. Um,
Great. And
yeah.
so planning, I mean, so how do you work on, planning ahead and making changes or so you were saying that you do your research by reading letters and looking at paintings and looking at the history and sort of how does it work? So do you go to the director at Charleston and say this is the direction I'd like to go in? Do you have a sort of meeting? How does it work?
So yeah, so like I mentioned, I'm part of the curatorial department. So I kind of
Right.
my direct line supervisor, line manager is the sort of curator, head of
Mhm.
collections, who's been at Charleston for sort of 25 years. He's not a horticulturist or a
Yeah.
plantsman. Probably couldn't tell a pea from a
Yeah.
peony.
Yeah.
But he's obviously got an interest in the art and the heritage, and an interest in the heritage of the garden and particular areas of the garden. Particularly, I suppose I'm referring to now sort of the hard landscaping. So if there's something that needs doing, for example, there's a pond on the lawn which has got some tiles which were designed by Vanessa Bell, sort of edging the pond. So those kind of had flaked off for whatever reason.
Yeah.
So they often have facsimiles.
Yeah.
Say that word right now.
Yeah.
Facsimiles made of these
Yeah.
things. Actually,
Yeah.
often working with a local work studio. I don't know if people have come across them.
Oh, yes, yeah,
Locally in
yes.
Charleston.
Hmm.
Um, so they'll create facsimiles of these things and put them, back in place. Or for
Yeah.
example, Duncan Grant's got one existing, or he apparently did one sculpture that we kind of know about,
Hmm.
which is a sort of small figurine, which sits next to one of the ponds.
Mm.
Facsimile made of that a couple of years ago,
Right.
and put back in situ. So it's kind of I guess that's kind of like a team collective effort. In terms of the things like the soft planting, I suppose I have quite a lot of free reign, which I'm quite lucky to have.
Hmm.
So if I think about something like, I guess I'm thinking about that more perennial planting, things like fruit trees or roses. Um, there are extracts from letters where, particular apple varieties will get mentioned.
Mm.
Beauty of Bath's a good example. In fact,
Right.
there's a Caroline Duffy poem where she talks about beauty, as she mentioned, as recently, I think it's called Charleston, perhaps, I can't remember what the poem's called, but it mentions this apple, Beauty of Bath, which is a really early
Yeah.
fruiting variety. It's
Yeah.
quite not particularly good to eat, but they're
Yeah.
quite
Yeah.
flowering abundantly. They're quite abundant. So
So what are the most challenging aspects for you gardening there in terms of maybe people's I know people come with quite strong ideas with a public garden that's also has a strong history of what they think it should be like or what it was like or so what are your challenges in terms of both physical gardening but also maintaining a garden that is so much in public gaze?
sure, I think because it's quite a small space, it can be quite tricky. So I feel like sometimes I'm under pressure
Mm.
for it to look good all of the time. So I had an interesting chat with Paul, who's the current Sittinghurst scholar recently. He came for a day at Charleston, and we were talking about roses. So
Mm,
roses, I think he was saying, you know, I've had difficulty with some roses on some borders, particularly
mm,
against walls. Some of the beds at Charleston, like I said, very free draining, very dry, and because of, I don't know, is this my pruning technique? I'm trying to follow that sort of, in some regards, that Sittinghurst style of pruning where everything's kind of immaculately pruned.
yeah,
You know, you do this lovely wending and bending
yeah,
stems, and you prune quite hard. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, have I done that too hard on a couple of roses? Is it me that's actually, you know, damaged them in this instance? Um, and speaking to Paul, he was kind of saying, well, actually, no, a lot of our roses are struggling. We've had a couple of very dry summers.
mm,
They
mm,
don't like the dry.
yeah,
This particular bed that the roses that I have had that are struggling is very
yeah,
dry, and sort of less fertile as well. So I guess it's thinking about those kind of things, and this sort of pressure to have perhaps certain plants like roses, or if it's a shrub rose in the middle of a border, I want to get a nice shrub rose. I want to plant a bare root rose, for example, from somewhere
mm,
like David Austin or
yeah,
Peel roses, but you plant it bare root and it's this tiny little thing. But yeah, I want to have abundant planting in the borders, so
yes,
I plant around it,
yeah,
perhaps with even a biennial plant like a larkspur,
mm,
and find that, you know, some of the roses don't like it. They don't like the competition, so it can
yeah,
be quite difficult in terms of, you know, there's this legacy of planting that I want to
yeah,
encourage, but
yeah,
also I want sort of, like, in some regards, people want instant gratification as well.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um, but it was nice to chat to somebody and discover that actually they've similar issues, and actually it was interesting hearing him talking about what's going on at Sissinghurst with the pruning. I don't know if this is something maybe you discussed on one of your chats. I'm not sure, but this idea actually they're starting to go a bit looser again with the pruning, and not prune so hard and things,
yeah,
and
yeah,
different
yeah,
approach again. And you know,
yeah.
I guess that's the benefit of being part of the horticultural community sometimes, as you get
Yeah.
to,
And I'm assuming that it's quite chalky there because you're right,
yeah,
right at the foot of the down. Well, you're pretty much in the downs, aren't you? So it's quite chalky and quite alkaline, I would
yeah,
think. Yeah.
exactly. It's
Yeah.
alkaline soil, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
you know,
And
roses are
and and in
rich.
terms of climate, because obviously climate, we've had a really, really dry spring here. And I mean, last winter was incredibly wet. I mean, with climate change and changing and unpredictability of climate. And as you mentioned before, Charleston, although it's kind of nestled into the downs, it is quite exposed, isn't it? I mean, I should imagine in the winter the wind whips through there. So are you finding that the climate is quite challenging, as it is with most gardens now?
Yeah, I suppose thinking about the climate, I suppose in some regards, I'm quite lucky with the palette of plants that already kind of that are part of that Bloomsbury heritage.
Mm, mm,
So if I take something, for example, like the cotton lavender, the Santolina,
mm.
it's a Mediterranean plant, so it's fairly obviously tolerant to the drought, but also relatively tolerant to something like wind. Other than the fact it might get windrock, but you know, if
Yeah,
you go to like Prospect, Derek Jarman, the Prospect Cottage, you know,
yeah,
Johnny pruners there, clips, I should say, the Santolina there beautifully, and you know, they're these make massive, beautifully gnarly shapes. Um,
yeah,
so the planting palette at Charleston, you've got things, for example, like Eryngium, sea holly, um, globe thistles, these things like I mentioned, like cardoons with a big silvery foliage. So I think a lot of the plants that were part of their palette
mm,
are naturally quite resistant,
mm,
uh, to those conditions that perhaps we're experiencing more of. You know, firstly that wind, like you mentioned, but also the drier conditions. But there are some things that, you know, the traditional cottage garden plants, like the roses or the
mm,
phloxes, for example,
mm,
um, which you, in some regards, perhaps are struggling a bit more. I mean, I found with phlox in particular, I think when I first sort of started reading about them, I sort of read this, you know, they're sort of full sun plants. You must give them absolute sunshine. And I found the one variety we had in the garden was David,
yeah,
very vigorous white one. I've found
yeah, lovely one. Yeah,
they tend to prefer actually sort of part shade in the
yeah,
garden,
yeah,
where they can keep a bit moisture, and actually they do quite well under the fruit trees. So I guess it's just
yeah,
after a certain amount of time you sort of you learn
yeah,
perhaps just to change the positioning of things, and you get to
yeah.
move things
Move it
around.
around. Yeah,
And to go back to sort of what I was talking about with this idea of Sir Peter Shepherd's planting ban back in the 80s, I think I would like to say, because I might sound like I don't adhere to his planting plan, but I think
yeah,
what the reality is actually is that when I started at Charleston in 2019, the garden wasn't anywhere near that planting plan.
right.
It had already obviously evolved. It had already had 35 years of evolution and 35,
Mm,
you know, 4 or 5 different gardeners, and
Mm,
modern cultivars of plants had already been introduced. Things like, Elianthus lemon queen, for example, which is a
mm,
tall perennial sunflower, or a more modern cultivar of phlox like David. I don't think it's a particularly old one.
mm,
Uh, so I might try and introduce, I have at points tried to introduce older cultivars of plants, phlox, for example, being an example, and found that actually they don't survive as perhaps well, and there's perhaps
mm.
a reason they're less easy to find through nurseries, but they're just perhaps not as vigorous.
Yeah,
As
yeah,
other.
yeah.
It's an interesting kind of, I want to say,
And I
predicament.
mean, one of the, well, in some of the images we saw greenhouse. So do you do propagation? Do you do your own propagation there as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose that's the other kind of demand, and this
Hmm.
idea of, like I say, this sort of almost instant gratification, but that's not necessarily fair to call it that. But it's this kind
Yeah,
of, it's what they do at Great Dixter and Sissinghurst
yeah.
and all these great gardens, quite sort of labour intensive. I'd say like arts and craft. That's floral gardening, I suppose. So I do a lot of kind of interplanting,
Hmm.
successional planting. I know from like Great Dixter they often have 6 different successive planting schemes in one year.
Mm.
For example, in the solar garden, I might not do quite that many, but I'll do the autumn sowings of things like larkspurs, like I mentioned,
Yeah,
maybe Ami majus, poppies as well are really important.
yeah,
Vanessa was painting poppies really early on. There's a lovely painting called Iceland Poppies, painted in 1916, I think it was. And you see kind of floral motifs around the house, whether it's things like oxeye daisies,
mm.
the common red field poppy. So I
Yeah,
will often grow some poppies, things like ladybird poppies. I obviously like Beth's poppy as well, named after Beth Chasso, so I'll try those kind of things. And
yeah,
then from this point onward, obviously I'm doing that kind of, you know,
yeah,
later summer bedding, I suppose. Cosmos,
yeah,
zinnias,
yeah,
everlasting flowers, which are also something they painted a lot. So it's
yeah,
just trying to create that really rich, vibrant succession.
yeah.
Maybe often choosing things like, mentioned in that letter, it was reds of all kinds, scabies, for
Mm.
a good example of that.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. It's lovely having both, letters and writing and art to sort of bounce off of and take inspiration from. I mean, that's such a joyful thing to work with, isn't it?
yeah,
Um,
it's really, I'm very blessed here.
and I think, although you were saying that the wall garden is quite small, and although Charleston is in its footprint is quite small, but in its stature is actually really large in a way. I mean, when you go there, you are in a fairly small space, but it punches above its weight because you've got all this history, you've got the house, you've got the shop, and now the galleries, which opened a few years ago, the new galleries, which are amazing, and the cafe. So there's a lot going on there, obviously.
Yeah, of
Um,
course. Um,
yeah, and
but
quite a footfall, I imagine. You're busy. I should imagine, from now onwards, people visiting from all over the world, I would think.
yeah, exactly. I think it's 2016 the house began to be open all year round. So it's been all year round. It's been open
Mm.
all year round since I started. For the entire time I've been at Charleston. So winter's very quiet. You can be in the garden and you might not see anyone on
Yeah.
some days, and actually can be therefore quite bleak sometimes.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and then we have a literary festival in May, and I don't know the exact footfall per day, but you could have a few thousand people walking through a small
Yeah.
walled garden in one day.
Yeah.
Um, so it's quite an interesting place to be just as a gardener in terms of like, I think maybe other gardeners have this at different gardens, I would have thought, but it's kind of like, social, sometimes
Yeah.
very much like on display as a gardener in this space, and other times you
Absolutely.
might not see anybody at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and I think the fact that we're open all year round, we have usually 3 or 4 festivals a year. Like you say, there's an exhibition space, there's a
Mhm.
cafe. There's now a new exhibition space and sort of learning centre in Lewes. The fact that it means also that this kind of evolution perhaps in the planting in the garden is also something that's important, because yes, they did garden, but I should also go back to that quote, this wasn't a gentleman's garden, nor was it a gardener's garden. They weren't actually horticulturalists, they were
Mm.
painters.
Mm.
I think Duncan was sort of had this sort of flair for the exotic. He
Yeah.
wanted to have pink flamingos on the pond, and liked growing red hot pokers, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
Brilliant photograph of him stood next to Angelica Garnett, next to these towering red hot pokers. I guess they're kind of phallic as well,
Yes.
and queer
Yeah.
man, he probably quite liked them. I think actually
Yeah.
launched an exhibition of his erotic drawings in New York, I believe. So yeah, and then Vanessa, I think, was a bit more kind of hands-on. Her sister Virginia writes of her sort of emerging from this variegated quilt of asters and artichokes. So I think she probably was in the borders, getting stuck
Mm,
in.
mm.
But they also had a gardener. They had a guy called, we referred to him as young Mr. Stephen, who was from the village of Firle. Don't think he was a particularly young man, but it seemed to be
Yeah.
his nickname. And then they had a housekeeper, Grace, and her husband, Walter, who was affectionately not referred to as the Dolt, which wasn't very kind.
Yeah.
But he was there doing the gardening. So I think it was probably perhaps a sort of slightly whimsical thing for them. You know,
Yeah.
we have
Yeah.
evidence that they went to Lewis and bought plants, or bought, you know, there's seed catalogues from companies like Carter's addressed to Duncan Grant.
Right.
And also they did some slightly unusual things. Like one year they just planted, you know, there's a bed at the end of the lawn, which is what I call the kind of display bed where we've currently got tulips growing. But I
Yeah.
think one year there's a particular painting which is lots of different gladioli of you know, every colour under the sun.
Yeah.
This real kind of jimble jamble of different colours.
Yeah.
So they were being experimental, and I think you look at the photographs, and you know, it wasn't. They're not actually. Leonard Wolfe at Monk's House was a real horticulturalist. Obviously, Beta,
Right.
Beta at Sissinghurst, of course. Other gardens
Yes.
locally, there's quite a few of them, but they weren't cataloguing things in the same way. They weren't
Yes. Yeah.
planting it the same way. You know, you look at some of the photographs and you see, you know, a bit of hedging, maybe the odd iris popping up, bearded irises. You might see, you know, the odd tall sunflower, but the borders don't really look necessarily abundant. Or
Mm.
you'll have, you know, some of the paintings, you know, fruit trees growing in the paths, out of the paths. So it's kind of like, you know, it wasn't a particularly designed and cultivated space, perhaps
Yeah.
with a, you know, whereas I'm there, well, I'm not now I used to be full time, but now I have the assistance of Tom, who works 3 days a week, and I work about that as well.
Yeah.
So the two of us work together, but we have a full time gardening team.
Yes. Yeah.
And we
Yeah.
have volunteers, so obviously it can be a certain way, and we have visitors who we want
Right.
to come back for repeat visits, and you know,
Right.
that's always my favourite thing when somebody says to me at the end of the season, and occasionally brings me a bottle of Harvey's beer or something, and they say, "Well, we've come to the garden, you know, 3 or 4 times this year, and it's been really inspiring." And that's
Lovely.
what I like
Yeah.
the most
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
my job, I suppose.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you were saying that because Lynn has put a question in the box saying, does Harry know what gardening help they had? My impression is that people of that class had others doing the work, household servants, nannies, presumably gardeners. So you've sort of covered that yes, they did have people coming and doing
Yeah,
stuff, you know, on the house and garden. And of
yeah,
course, Monk's house you referred to, which is just over the hill, really, isn't it?
yeah, of course,
It's
yeah,
within walking distance was Virginia Woolf's house, which, and of course, yeah, all of the outside influences that they would have had with people like Beta and Harold and all of the sort of, you know, the other members or other people who were around the sort of fringe of the Bloomsbury set.
yeah,
Um,
exactly. I think they would have been sharing plants and, you know, stories and planting plans and experimenting and whatnot.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Adam's put a comment in here saying, you're the perfect match for this garden. Really enjoying listening and we'll visit this summer. Please, could you tell us more about your Festival of Gardening? How? Well, we're just about to actually. And how are you incorporating sustainability into the garden? Let's do the sustainability first because we've got some news about the gardening festival. So yeah, go on.
For sure. So yeah, so sustainability is a buzzword and is important, and it's kind of why I got into gardening, I suppose. Really,
Yeah,
I was thinking about food and yeah, just more sustainable food systems and all this kind of stuff. So that was my avenue into it. So it's really important to me as well. And also when I started at Charleston, one of the reasons I suppose that would have encouraged me 6 years ago was this idea that the garden was managed on organic principles, and it
hmm
still is. So we don't use any fertilizers or sprays anywhere really around the site. We haven't needed to.
hmm
Today I had Tom, myself, and a volunteer, Gitty. I've got some great volunteers. Shout out to Gitty and Rebecca and Jane and, you know, Torsi, who've been with me quite a few years now, and we have this expression at Charleston which we term groveling in the gravel, which is quite literally, you know, on all fours weeding gravel, because there's quite a lot of
Right.
gravel around the site.
Yeah.
But today we were literally, you know, weeding and actually strumming out the net outside the loos. Not exactly
The glamour of it all. Yeah.
a glamorous task. This is the gardener's
Yeah.
life sometimes.
Yeah.
So we're not spraying Roundup on
No,
things.
no.
And I think that does sometimes pose, in some regards, difficult questions because we
Yeah.
have, like I mentioned, we've got these lovely mosaics, which were sort of pieced together using fragments of old ceramic and
Mhm.
tiling and whatnot. And I've got things that might have self-seeded into the cracks. Well, things like dandelions, which have nice big taproot.
Yeah.
But even things like Eryngium
Yeah.
planum, which sort of self-seeds into the cracks, and it would be easier just to spray something in there and kill them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I can't, so I'm not going to do. I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
right next
Yeah.
to a pond where I have newts, and every year
Yeah.
I see the newts, and I pick out some newts and show them to school children or something. And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
important to
Yeah.
me not to do that. So we'll have to try and weed them, and actually
Yeah.
it does damage ultimately the mosaics. But that's why every 10, 15 years there'll be a funding application usually put in, and somebody will come and restore those.
Restore. Okay.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and other things sustainability wise, yeah, I mean, around the site, I suppose we've started creating dead hedges. In one particular area of the site, we didn't really have any sort of, say, flower rich, meadow rich grassland. Kind of, there's small little areas which we leave unmown. I've managed to actually sort of get a wildflower meadow established in one area which used to be a bramble thicket. But I kind of go along those sort of permaculture sort of principles of zoning, really.
Hmm.
Around the pond, we've got certain areas that are a bit wilder, some that
Hmm.
are looked after more. But you went to Charleston today, and you might, funny enough, Gitty, I mentioned one of her friends apparently had come to see it recently and referred to it as a bit unkempt. And actually, I remember we had this conversation in staff meetings at points. I remember somebody early on when I was at Charleston referring to it as a bit unkempt and untidy, and that's because you might have things like nettles,
Hmm.
you know, growing along the edge of the offices or on the edge of a flint wall.
Yeah.
But I think that's sort of a conscious choice, and it's a conscious choice for me now, definitely, because I think it was always a farmyard, and it was always
Yeah.
supposed to be rustic, and there were always supposed to be nettles, and there's an abundance of cow parsley,
Yeah.
um, and
Yeah.
actually, it's really important for me just to have that diversity across the site. Um,
Sure. Yeah. And then, well, then that brings us to the garden festival, which is great. So Adam, thank you for asking us, but we were going to mention it anyway. So the garden festival is from the 17th to the 20th of July, which is not that far away now. And in fact, we've got an exciting thing to say that Garden Masterclass are partnering with Charleston this year, and we have a talk that will open the festival on the 17th at 1 p.m. Which is myself talking to Rebecca Lemonius from Long Barn, Claire Greenslade, who was the head gardener at Hestercombe, and Julia Bolton, who's Beth Chatto's granddaughter, and it's called The Footsteps of Giants. So that's it was an idea that I posed to Melissa Perkins, who was at Charleston, and saying, how about this as an idea? And she jumped at it, which was fantastic. So I'm very excited that we're doing that, but there's lots of other people over the days, the 3 days, and in fact, in the chat box, I've put the link to the Charleston Festival. But if you go into charleston.org.uk, you will go through. And actually, it was only announced today, the festival, the lineup, wasn't it? So
yeah, and just by chance as well, it was
yeah,
fortunate.
yeah, we'd
We've had
scheduled to
to feel
chat to
quite
you,
some
and
time.
then that's great. No, perfect timing, absolute
Yeah,
synchronicity, and which is lovely, because we wouldn't have been able to talk about it if we hadn't had the press release. So it's lovely that that's happening. But what are the highlights? Are there any things that, because I've had a quick look through what else is happening. Obviously, I've been very immersed in our little aspect of it. But what other highlights are you excited about at the festival this year?
Well, I'm actually off on Sunday for the first time, going to a private garden in Kent, just
Hmm.
near Canterbury somewhere, which I think you may have seen featured. I think it's been on television. It's probably been in various magazine articles over the years. It's a private garden of someone called Andrew Salter. Um,
Hmm.
it's this amazing. He's got this almost like wooden house, almost like cabin-like structure, very sort of American style, surrounded by what's, I suppose, like a kind of Great Dixter-esque prairie.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
really know because I've not been yet.
No,
Um,
I've only seen images of it, and I've seen it in Gardens Illustrated, and it just looks wonderful, doesn't it? It's
it's
magical.
incredible,
Yeah, yeah,
incredible. So then it sort of eases out into this
yeah.
meadow, as I understand it. So I'm actually going there on Sunday because he's advertised on Instagram an
Oh,
open.
great.
So it's kind of like nice timing for that. And he features as part of a book that's been released, written by, I think it's Claire Foster.
Hmm.
Um, so he's being interviewed, and we'll be in conversation with Claire Foster and Arthur Parkinson. He
Right.
also features in the book, and there's
Right.
obviously Garden. You know, he's a sort of flamboyant. He's a Charleston-esque character actually. Arthur,
Yes.
I've got a
Yes.
lot of
Yes.
respect for him. And he actually came on early on. Actually, it might have been 2021. He came along and planted some tulips with me at Charleston. He kind of got me
Oh.
in this his dolly tubs. We have dolly tubs in certain areas of the site,
Yeah.
and I kind of
Yeah.
took on that. That was almost how I learned how to do that sort of lasagna style tulip planting.
Lovely.
So he's coming back, and they're having that conversation. We've got Francis Tophill coming
Hmm.
and talking with Angie Lewin on, I think, the value of wildflowers and meadows.
Oh,
So yeah,
lovely.
loads of really interesting stuff.
Mm.
And then there's also this important to add. There's a kind of there's usually some great nursery
Yes. Yeah.
nurserymen and women. So we've got Paul at Pelham Plants,
Yep.
Steve Edney from No Name Nursery, and I think Toby from Zophian Plants, who kind of regularly come. And they used to be joined by Colin from Pineview.
Yeah. Yeah.
Plants, but he's since retired. But there's always these like
Yeah.
local
And there's sort of
Southeast.
little workshops too, aren't there? They're called Fringe Events, so they're little workshops. And there's one that caught my eye, which was creating a garden sort of sketchbook, notebook, journal, which I thought looked amazing. I absolutely looks wonderful. I also saw Mark Diacono is coming as well. So I've only really just had a quick look through it because, of course, I only saw the full lineup today. So very, very exciting. And so just to mention again, the link is in the chat box, but obviously and this talk goes onto YouTube, so anybody who's watching, if you just go to charleston.org.uk/festival of the garden, then everything is there. And how it works, and I think I'm right in saying that people buy a day ticket for each day. And then they can go to any of the talks that are happening during that day. That's correct, isn't it?
That's correct. So you can buy day tickets, or you can buy individual event tickets as well.
Right. Yeah.
And I must add also that the fringe events that you mentioned, and also to come and obviously experience the garden. The garden also I should add is more generally is completely free. So anytime the garden, all year round, the garden at Charleston is free. That was a decision that we made, I think, in 2020.
Lovely.
So turn up. We're shut Monday, Tuesdays, but turn up, any day from Wednesday through to Sunday, and you can just experience the garden without having to pay, which is nice.
Wonderful.
But yeah, back to the festival. Yeah, the fringe talks are free, and they take place in our orchard. They're very informal, conversational, and it's always really fun because often maybe it'll be ex-volunteers, for example, who have volunteered with me at Charleston, who end up at places like Stissinghurst, or Josh, who's my ex-assistant, now works with Charlie at Net, for example.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So yeah, it's really nice to kind of have those, or another friend, George, now works at Westdean.
Yes.
That's really nice to have this connection for me as well. And I often invite, that's my role. Melissa, who's my colleague, does much of the main event programming, but I often get more involved with the fringe, and it's so nice to see kind of budding horticulturalists involved. And just sharing their knowledge, and it becomes very much a sharing space, which is nice.
Yes, definitely. No, and there's always a lovely atmosphere at the festival. I mean, last year I was chairing a talk between Luciano Jubilee and Fergus Garrett, and it was boiling. It was absolutely boiling. I think it was probably one of the hottest days we had last summer. But it's always such a lovely event, and a really nice atmosphere, and has a really lovely festival atmosphere, and always very busy, and a nice social occasion too for people to sort of catch up with each other. So
exactly.
Lovely.
It might be them indoors this year, so you don't have to get.
That's what Melissa was saying, because exactly it'll either be pouring with rain or scorchingly hot. So probably best to have the talks inside. Yeah. Okay. Well, Harry, thank you so much. It's been lovely talking to you, and we've talked about it for such a long time to have you on, and I'm really pleased that we've done it. And I look forward to seeing you in July, if not before, at the festival. But thanks for sharing so much about the garden.
I enjoyed it. Yeah.
Very, very exciting. And so
I look forward to your event.
Yeah. All right. And all the very best, and take care. Okay.
All the best. Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks, Harry. Bye-bye. Bye.